Yeah, so again, Michael, thank you very much for coming. And I have prepared a very, very small, short intro. So kind of biographical, kind of background informations on you. So Mikhail Nakonechnyi received his PhD from the University of Oxford in 2020 and is now postdoctoral researcher at the Aleksanteri Institute at the Finnish Center of Russian and Eastern European Studies at the University of Helsinki. His work has been published in Kritika, Cahiers du monde russe, the Journal of History of Medicine, and in a volume of collected articles that has been edited by Alan Barenberg and Emily D. Johnson. The title of this volume is Allied Sciences and Rethinking the Gulag, Identities, Sources, and Legacies. It was published last year, that means in 2022. His principal research interest is the comparative history of prison healthcare and medicine. And currently he's working on the five-year project that is called GULAGECHOES, and which is funded by the European Research Council. I think, if I'm right here, otherwise please correct me, it's a kind of an ERC grant, and it's about the, constructing ethnic identities in the Soviet Gulag and post-Soviet prison systems. And today, Mikhail is going to talk on Traverse of the Moribunds, the journeys of invalid ex-prisoners released from the Gulag forced labor camps between 1930 and 1953. So, Michael, thank you again for accepting our invitation and for giving the talk. And we are all looking forward to hearing more about the Gulag system. And the floor is yours.
Thank you so much. And I really appreciate this kind of invitation. It's an honor to present preliminary results of my hopefully future book today. So I began my talk with a quotation from an interview conducted by Elza Guchinova with Churimov. And he recalled his encounter with a group of ex-prisoners in the Western Siberia during the war. I remember how a train of hittable boxcars arrived in Novosibirsk. The doors opened and the people were not jumping out. They literally fell out of the boxcars and started to crawl to the feeding post right over the tracks. Trains were going to and fro. It was a large station, shunting trains, switching boxcars. Probably many of them were cut. They were absolutely exhausted. We have been told that these were the nationals, natsmeni, the representatives of the national minorities, from the labor camps. They were also transferring there and ate at the feeding points, very thin soup, at least it was hot. Our uncle returned from Palavinka camp. He was skin and bones. He told us that the production norms were high, but nourishment was scarce. If one failed to reach the norm, he was denied even that scant food. If a person fell ill, he went to the camp doctor. The camp doctor did this, grabs one ass. If he felt that only skin remained, he issued an administrative act in the document. Dystrophy of this and this degree, recommend for release. One got bread for 5 days and put in a boxcar. We saw these people crawling without any strength over the railway tracks in Novosibirsk. End quote. So crucially, these people in this quotation were not prisoners or internees of the labor army, but formerly free people. And their journeys form the focal point of my today's talk. When writing about transportation in the Gulag, a system of forced labor institutions under Stalin, both historians and memoirists habitually evoke iconic images of so-called etapirovanie, the massive, regular, and frequently deadly transfers of prisoners to and between the myriad penal localities of the Soviet Union. My talk, however, focuses on another type of journey that has been almost completely omitted from the scholarship, the return of gravely ill ex-inmates from their places of detention after procedure of so-called early release on medical grounds. I argue that this idiosyncratic, understudied human backflow out of the penitentiary system is as important as the relocation of prisoners within it, because each episode of ex-convicts' conveyance directly correlates with the reliability of the mortality statistics of the locality from where the invalids originally departed. As I will show, the deaths of the discharged invalids were certainly not confined to the territories of camps and colonies. Fatalities inevitably continued to occur during travel and at transport hubs along the way. Therefore, the principal aim of my today's talk is to reconstruct for the audience these obscure journeys and to chart a spectrum of the possible outcomes for the discharged during these relocations, depending on a time and place. And the second goal is to demonstrate the wide temporal and spatial proliferation of this kind of mortality. Because one can always present the counter-argument that deaths after release were not quantitatively significant or did not happen at all. Consequently, here I will try to answer two straightforward questions. First, was the mortality of the invalids after release a widespread phenomenon? And furthermore, what sources and methods can scholars use to quantify these deaths and to get some sort of understanding of its scale? So here is a brief summary of my talk. Firstly, I'm going to talk about the current situation in historiography on the issue. And as you can imagine, it's extremely politicized and very contentious. Then I'm going to explain my research goals and show how this procedure of release on medical grounds was used to reduce mortality by camp authorities. After that, I reconstruct for you the search of appropriate sources, which was actually a very difficult analytical task. And that actually allowed me to formulate a new method that allow me to answer the questions that I pose. And finally, I will present to the audience a glimpse of the argument that I'm making both in my PhD thesis and on early release on medical grounds, and hopefully in my book. So several case studies of various camps, forced labor camps, and also a brief inquiry into the journeys of medically released invalids who survived the initial stage. So let us begin with the historiography. It is impossible to articulate my own research without a review of peculiar situations surrounding the topic of the Gulag death tolls and mortality rates. So before the opening of the Soviet archives in 1989, scholarship on the subject was dominated by so-called totalitarian school of Sovietology, spearheaded by Robert Conquest. They proposed extremely high number of deaths, reaching tens of millions. And another major argument that they made is that the releases from the system were exceptionally rare, and that almost none of the prisoners who went in the system went out. And they implicitly and sometimes even explicitly, they compared the Gulag to the Nazi death camps and Auschwitz without ovens. But the source base at the time was apparently not sufficient enough to make any precise estimates. So it was only based only on the memoirs and some statistical extrapolations, but no official documents were available. In the 1980s, these arguments were heavily criticized by a group of the younger scholars, and they are sometimes labeled revisionists. And although I think that the term is a bit too pejorative, but in any case, they propose much lower figures for the Soviet political repression in general and Gulag mortality specifically. After the opening of the archives in 1991, or the partial opening of the archives, it seems that the documents that came out of the central archive of the Gulag system in Moscow vindicated the revisionist critique. So that was the initial impression in the literature. And the main argument that these scholars who criticized conquest put forward was that the documents were not only genuine, but they were more or less reliable because they were secret. There was absolutely no incentive for the authorities to manipulate and falsify the statistics that came out. So according to these records that become published in the early 1990s, out of 80 to 20 million people who passed through the Soviet system of incarceration, only 1.7 million prisoners died in the camps and colonies and prisons between 1930 and 1953 in absolute figures. It's still a huge number, but it was considerably lower than it was presumed before the opening of the archives. In relative averages, for, as you can see on the graph, for famine and war periods, official registered death rates fluctuated and sometimes reached very high proportion, reaching up to 20 per annum, for example, during the war, or 15 per annum during the famine in 1922-93. And finally, according to these central records that were published in the beginning of the 1930s, and this came as the most unexpected, probably, Soviet penitentiaries worked like a revolving door, a very powerful and mesmerizing image. And ostensibly, almost 90% of the Gulag population left the camp system alive, and only 10% died. And the lack of criticism of these statistics for many, many years, for decades, created some sort of tentative consensus in the literature that this subject is more or less explored. But the main goal of my research is actually to counter this stereotype with a potential revision. And of course, I'm not the first one who doubted the reliability of these central statistics that were published at the beginning of the 1990s. I won't pretend that I was the first. So Oleg Hlivnyuk, Michael Ellman, and particularly Golfo Alexopoulos, whose work I greatly admire, they were the first who draw attention to a certain practice that camp authorities used extensively: early release on medical grounds. So the argument was that there was a deceptive scheme concealed behind this process. And so according to Articles 457 and 458 of the Soviet Criminal Procedural Code, a prisoner who was diagnosed by special medical commission with severe incurable disease had a legal right to be freed before official expiration of a prison sentence. And this procedure existed in the Gulag since its inception in 1930, up to the death of Joseph Stalin, and actually beyond until now. And the process itself was called aktirovka. So this is a quintessential description of the procedure by one of the former Gulag convicts, Nikolai Kozhin. I quote, "In the barracks of the Cultural Educational Department, there were several tables where camp doctors were sitting in white robes and military uniforms. This was a commission tasked with the release of prisoners whose health degraded so much that it was impossible to squeeze any labor out of them. These inmates, who some time ago were actual people, are now turned into shadows of the former selves, living skeletons covered with pale, tight skin. Their gaze is totally blank. One can read a total detachment in their eyes. It is not necessary to be a doctor to understand that these people are doomed, morally and physically crushed. They walked towards the table with huge difficulty. The ultimate rationale behind the procedure should never be confused with mercy or compassion. It is just a technical, pragmatic way to get rid of the totally useless ballast. The fate of those medically discharged is shrouded in secrecy, since it is absolutely evident that they are not in the condition to conduct a long journey and to reach their homes alive." end quote. So initially presented by Soviet penologists as a humane and progressive measure, a sort of compassionate release, actually borrowed from the Western practice, it is now obvious that it sometimes played a totally different and much more sinister role in the Gulag context. So it has been argued by several historians, most recently Golfo Alexopoulos, that this medical discharge was employed by camp administration on a massive scale to artificially reduce death rates. So the idea behind releasing emaciated dying prisoners on the verge of death was to exclude these fatalities from official medical registries and set them free and set them as far away from the jurisdiction of the camp as possible, so they could die outside the perimeter of the zone of the camp, and thus the mortality was falsified. But so this is the instruction for invalid certification from the Gulag, 1941, so-called temporary list of illnesses. That served as the justification and for early release on medical grounds. So basically, just to rehash the slides very quickly. So this is the current scholarship on the Gulag mortality according to the central records. So absolute death toll 1.7 million. Gulag worked as a revolving door. 90% of the population left the system alive, and only 10% died. And this is the picture of the invalids that I spoke about, and it's very rare. It's extracted from the archives of the camp medical department, and you could see the degree of the MSc. This is a very, very rare image because the censorship was ubiquitous in the camps, and they were very, very keen on not letting these kind of images into the public sphere. And so you could see the degree of emaciation of people who were actually forced to travel after release from the camps on this picture. And these invalids were subjected to this coercive travel. So as soon as they got this release decision on their hands, they were transferred to what was known as barracks of the discharged, where they were concentrated before transportation. Then they were given a train ticket and some ration, and then transported to train station. After that, they were put in trains, sometimes on barges, depending on the camp, on the locality, and were sent either to their relatives, if they existed, or to the civilian hospitals, or to the administrative exile, if they were deemed too politically dangerous. Then, and the fourth stage was the actual traveling, and then the arrival of the destination, the fifth stage, if they survived. So, but the chief blank spot in this argument about early release on medical grounds is that actually the scholarship, it poses this very important issue, but it didn't follow up precisely what happened with these people after release. They kind of disappear. If you read the literature, you see that there is no proof that they actually died. So logically, of course, we can presume that they were dying on a massive scale, but there is no evidence, archival evidence, proving that these people died on a significant scale to affect the mortality. So here is, I hope, this my contribution to the argument, and my thesis was actually dedicated to this conundrum. So how to prove that these released people actually died? Because you can counter-argue that, well, how could you trace a scheme that was intentionally concealing deaths and not recording them? So how could you record something that is deliberately left unrecorded? So that was the conundrum. And until we have actually precise recalculations and precise, it's if you are very skeptical, you can make a case that, well, maybe they were not even dying on a big scale. So that was the starting point of my research. So we know that hundreds of thousands probably of those people were subject to this procedure, but we know precious little of what actually happened with them. And the question was how to trace and quantify the mortality. But the answer came to me very unexpectedly when I was researching the local records of the camps. And that's very important, because the previous scholarship predominantly, it builds only on central records in Moscow, so the summary reports of the central apparatus. And very few people actually went into the archives of the camps themselves, and not even because scholars were lazy or non-interested. It's just because the vast majority of the records are still not open, and they were never declassified. Even in the liberal Yeltsin times, they were remained in the archives of the prison system itself, or of the police, or the FSB, of the secret police, and they were not allowing civilian scholars to work in those archives. Although there were several exceptions to this rule, and one of those exceptions is Bezemenlak, a huge camp in Kuibyshevskaya, now Samarskaya Oblast, near Volga, that was tasked with building the air factories. They were building engines for planes, and this archive ended up in the state system, which is much more accessible, and that allowed me actually to work with the medical files of its administration. And what I discovered there is that the Soviets were so obsessive in recording everything that they actually recorded the deaths after release, but they were especially during the war when the mortality was massive, they actually had a problem on their hands. You can clearly see that the medics, the doctors who were tasked to record the deaths of prisoners, they were struggling how to record them. And the thing was that those subject to this early release were in such a bad shape, and the health was so abysmal that they died immediately after release, even not embarking on a journey. So they were dying in the same hospitals on a massive scale, but in a different legal status and as a free person. So, and the doctors were really puzzled how to calculate and how to record these deaths. So, and you can see in this document, if you look at the right end, you could see that these hand marks, where they were either adding these deaths and then subtracting them, because they actually were interested in keeping the death rate low, because if the death rate was very high, they could be prosecuted, as counterintuitive as may sound, because the Gulag was interested in keeping, the central authorities were pressing the localities to keep the death rate as low as possible, not because they cared for the prisoners, but because it was a workforce. So in order to keep the labor productive, there was an incentive to keep the workforce in a more or less healthy condition. But of course, the actual situation on the ground was so bad that it was impossible. So, and this is actually one of the reasons why the doctors had the incentive to keep the death rates low. So in this small local sheet that I showed to you, you could see that the local report initially gave the figure 341 deaths, with the explanation of the total number of the released disabled persons who died, 33. So initially they included those who were dying after release in the total number that they reported to Moscow. But then something changed, and the doctors crossed out the initial number, subtracted these 33 deaths, and entered a new number of deaths, 308, with a new explanation besides the dead release disabled. So, and if you check the central records which went to the center, you could see that they sent even lower, like 291 deaths goes to the center. And thus these 33 deceased released persons remain concealed on the local level. And the average monthly mortality rate is underestimated. And camp doctors present themselves to be more effective because the death rate declined. And then the next question that I asked, okay, this was the local level, but what about Moscow? How did the Moscow reacted, the center, this administrative center reacted to what was going on the grounds during these war years with these mass death of the released prisoners right in the camps? So, and this is Gulag director Viktor Grigorievich Nasetkin, Commissar of State Security. And I found this directive that he signed again during the war to all camp commanders. And it's a very important document. And it turned out to be crucial for me to reveal the deception and to prove that the mortality rates were actually understated. So I quote, "To all directors of camps, regional camp and colony commanders, top secret, we are receiving inquiries from several peripheral locations about how they should account the prisoners who died after their release from camps or colonies. Gulag clarifies that data on the freed prisoners who died in the camps and colonies right after the discharge should be put in a separate explanatory accounting sheet alongside with the general medical report. Peripheral locations should not include these dead former prisoners into mortality reports on civilian camp personnel or prisoners per se. Signed, Gulag Director, Commissar of State Security, Nasetkin, March 25, 1943. And this directive is extremely important for several obvious and not so obvious reasons. So the devil here lurks in the details. First, it confirms that the situation of this unprecedented wartime crisis, the central authorities actually sanctioned the exclusion of those people who died freed, but were so sick that they could not leave the camps from the official registries. But what is crucial for historians is that, as I said, the Gulag authorities were so obsessive that they decided to create a double parallel accounting of those deaths on the local level, and trace the mortality. So this is another directive coming from the chief Gulag doctor. So the Gulag had its own medical service, and the chief Gulag doctor, Colonel Lloyden, he actually requested to trace these additional fatalities, concealed fatalities, in a separate report and send it to Moscow. So, and that was a sort of eureka moment for me, and I realized that means if Moscow demanded to trace these fatalities in every single camp that existed, which was 112, I think, localities, that means that every local camp actually has this report. And my suspicion turned out to be true. In the same archive, with the help of Alexander Repenitsky, the local historian, I managed to acquire this report of these additional fatalities. And you can see that it's actually statistically significant. It's not insignificant. You could see that, for example, in March, 84 released people died in the camp, in addition to regular, sort of registered deaths of regular prisoners. In April, 109, and overall, it's 355 prisoners who died from January 1943 up to October 1943. So in this, then basically I had my method very clearly laid out in front of me. So I took these local records and compared them with the central records for Bezemen-Lag, and then just added these omitted fatalities and then revealed the degree of the understatement of the central records. And you could see that it was actually significant. So you can't brush off these fatalities easily. And at least 20% was actually undercounted. So every fifth prisoner was undercounted. So you can see that mortality undercount for this period is practically and quantitatively significant. Official mortality figure in the central statistics for these 10 months was 1,424 prisoners, but in reality, 1,779 prisoners and ex-prisoners combined died in the camps in this time frame. So this means 20% undercount. But then again, the next question was it maybe an outlier, or it was happening only in this camp and other camps were maybe more survivable? And luckily, I managed again to find other reports of this sort in the archives of the other camps. And you again see hundreds and hundreds of people dying in this new capacity. So again, in Kargapallak, which is a camp located several hundred miles away from Bizimenlak to the north, you again see very significant understatement of mortality, 23%. In Yarginlak, which is also in Arkhangelsk, again 20%. So I had several case studies that show that at least in the war years, in the crisis years, you could see this massive mortality of people who could not even embark on this journey. But this was not the end of the story, because a lot of those people, they died right in the camp, right in the hospitals. But some of them still had enough strength to embark on a journey. Because as you remember, I mentioned that they were supposed, in theory, to be transferred to the civilian healthcare system, to their relatives, or to the administrative exiles. And they were given a train ticket and some food. And here you could see the norms for daily rations of the released Gulag prisoners and labor army. And my caloric and the estimates of the calories, the amount of calories that they got. And you could see, especially unsurprisingly, for the catastrophic war years, the amount of calories that the food that they were given was not only insufficient in terms of calories, it was actually very detrimental from a medical point of view, because if you release a very emaciated person with what was known as dystrophy of the third grade, which is extreme starvation disease, it's a euphemism of the Soviet medical lexicon, signifying starvation disease. If you give them rye bread, you basically provoke death, because you should not feed people who are emaciated with salt fish or rye bread. It causes death. And that surprisingly, these type of food actually provoked mass mortality of people on the trains who were departing from the camps. So next we move to what was happening with people who managed to survive this initial stage, boarded the trains, and then sent away from the localities. Again, this is the war years, because it's the most vivid example. You could see that thousands of people were released in 8 administrative territorial divisions of the USSR: Omskaya, Sverdlovskaya, Tulskaya, Arkhangelskaya, Kharkovskaya, Chuvashskaya, Chitinskaya Oblast, and Altaysky Krai. And you could see that the vast majority from this document went by themselves. So they were not accompanied by relatives, as they should. They were not accompanied by the camp officials. They were just thrown into the boxcars and just removed from the camp. And only tiny percent was picked up by relatives or sent to civilian hospitals or to the social security establishment. That is unsurprising, because during the war, half of the country was occupied by the Nazis. And a lot of the prisoners have no family or relatives, because some were killed in the ensuing genocide, some were evacuated to the Urals, and so basically they had no relatives to return to. So they were basically left to their own devices in these travels, in the very being on the verge of death, basically. And unsurprising is that these conditions and provoked mass mortality incidents. And one quote, very vivid quote from Arkhangelsk on 14 February 1942, Procurator Chicherin wrote to the Regional Party Committee Secretary Ogorodnikov: "Recently, there were occurrences when former prisoners released from the camps as invalids, old people, and others die on the way home just because they are not treated humanely by the personnel of the state offices and because of the camp employees' formalistic approach to provisioning of the released prisoners for their return journeys. Thus, according to the report of the Procurator of Kanashensky district, several dead bodies are regularly removed from every passing train on Kanosha station. From January 2 to February 5th, 57 people died at a railway station or were taken from the rail cars already dead. 50 of them were discharged from Yagrinlak corrective labor camp as invalids. On January 23rd, it was discovered that among the 10 corpses taken from the echelons, one had a liver cut out by the two ex-prisoners from the same train who consumed them as food. Such excessively high mortality among inmates released from Yagrinlag is explained by the fact that they are not given any rations upon release while traveling from Molotovsk to Kanosha for 6-7 days in a row. So another typical example can be found in another order in Chelyabinsk, in another region, from April 12, 1943, and signed by its deputy head, Major of State Security Butorov. It read, "In several instances, the sick who could travel neither on foot nor via the railroad because of the state of their health were sent to Kyshtym railway station. Moreover, prisoners afflicted with dysentery and diphtheria were released and sent to Kyshtym station, which was a direct source for the dissemination of the infectious diseases. Because of this, many of the released were collected from the railway station and transferred to the local city hospital in a grave condition, and a significant proportion of them later died due to delayed hospitalization. Several corpses were collected right from the hall of the railway station." And then the third example, which is actually the most egregious one in my view, is in Tashkent, Uzbekistan, was chosen as one of these chief destinations during the war to accept these released very sick prisoners. And you could see, so I found the report of the railroad procurator in Tashkent railway station, which describes in a very excruciating detail the statistics and what was going on at this Tashkent station. And he describes in very emotive terms that the station was engulfed with this human migration stream from the camps, like thousands of people arrived. And because they were in a very bad condition, they started to die every month. They accumulated on the train station. Nobody really cared for them. The city authorities really didn't care for them. And they started to die like flies. So you can see, and he provided the statistics from January 1943 up to December 1943. You could see that like 20, 30, 50 people each month were died, and died right at the train station, 341 people. So this is very quantitatively significant. And overall, 743 people died in this time frame. So this was the second stage, so the mortality of the prisoners during the journeys. But actually, some proportion of these people who were released, they actually managed to survive and were picked up by civil hospitals as they should. And this is example, one such case concerns Viktor Pavlovich Andreevsky, who died in 1944. And he was released on medical grounds, put on a train. He survived his journey, but then he was taken from the train and put into a civilian hospital. And then he basically died from a condition that he acquired in the Gulag, but he died in a civil registration system. And his relatives, they provided me with his death certificate. And you see that he died from TB and dystrophy. Again, this is starvation disease. But he was, of course, his death was not registered by the camp. So that was the whole point, to put them as far away from the camp as possible and not register their deaths. And this is another case when a prisoner was actually picked up by relatives. So this was rare, but it still happened. So this is Isidor Vikensievich Vanok, who was actually a political prisoner charged with anti-Soviet agitation, 5810. And sent to Kraslag forestry camps for 7 years. He was released as invalid on medical grounds from a camp in February 1943, picked up by his son. And his son remembers that he was so emaciated that he could barely walk, and died at home 2 days later. So basically, we can actually conclude. So if we want to calculate the actual death rate of this or that corrective labor camp or colony under Stalin for this particular year, we require not only the official records of the deaths of the actual prisoners, but these three kind of additional tiers or layers, if you'd like. So those who died immediately in the camp after release, those who died during travel, during the return travel, and those who died 1 month after if those who managed to survive. And because some people died at their relatives and some people died in the civilian hospitals from afflictions that they acquired in the Gulag. And only when we combine these numbers, then we can arrive at the actual death rate of the institution. And if we take the release statistics that was published in the early 1990s at face value, we're actually being deluded, because the system is presenting itself in a better light. Because if you have a system with a 90% survival rate, then you can say, well, it's harsh, but it's not as harsh because only 10% died, although it's still huge. But actually, the release statistics concealed these emaciated, dying people. And it was an informal practice to artificially reduce death rates. And actually, there are sources still unscrutinized in the archives that can allow us to arrive at much more a precise estimate. Of course, it won't be perfect, and of course, it is impossible actually to arrive at a precise. But there are ways to arrive at much more plausible estimate than we have now. So, and actually in my PhD thesis, I managed to find the total number of people, of prisoners, not only prisoners as a legal category. There were others, so it's understated figure, but it's still a start. So from 1930 up to 1953, 1 million people were cast out like that from the system. And of course, we should not think that all of those people were in equally horrible condition. So in less crisis years, the conditions of the travel were better. So some actually managed to survive, but they were not in significant quantities. So 500,000 of people were released during the worst years, during the war. And my argument that I'm making in my thesis and in my book, that vast majority of them actually died because it was just impossible to survive in winter of 1932, 1933, with no food, being in a horrible state of health, and being forced to travel, because Soviet Union was a huge country, to travel in winter, often undressed and poorly dressed, for like thousands of miles, like in Uzbekistan. And these journeys basically were killing those people in a very, very large numbers. So, and I think that introduction of this summary statistics is an absolutely essential step, but only a first step, to quantify these death rates and to assess the real human toll of the Gulag system. Thank you so much for your attention.